The hardcore punk song "Depression" by Black Flag was written, like the majority of their songs, by guitarist Greg Ginn. This is an early song in the band's catalog, which provides listeners with an intriguing opportunity in that the band went through four singers in fairly swift succession, and all four sang a recorded version of this song. The band was started by Ginn and singer Keith Morris, and they recorded the first version of "Depression." Morris, however, left in 1979, in part because he felt the band was rehearsing too much and playing too few gigs, and he created another essential hardcore band, the Circle Jerks. Black Flag then hired one of their fans as the replacement singer, Ron Reyes. Reyes recorded another version of "Depression" and was in the band when they appeared in the celebrated documentary film on the early days of hardcore, The Decline of Western Civilization by Penelope Spheris. In 1980, Reyes quit in the middle of a performance in Redondo Beach because he felt the scene forming around the band was becoming too violent. They replaced Reyes with Des Cadena, another fan, and recorded yet another version of "Depression." All three of these versions can be heard on the compilation album Everything Went Black, released in 1982 on Ginn's label SST Records. Hearing these three early versions of the song permits us to make a couple of observations. First, the instrumental arrangement stays mostly the same. The song begins with feedback generated by what sounds to be open strings. The main riff then enters, and we have a verse, a chorus, and an interlude, and that cycle goes through several times. The more interesting observations pertain to the singing. Keith Morris perhaps most closely approximates traditional quasi-melodic punk singing. As we will see, many of his notes simply follow the roots of the chords, with some interesting exceptions. Reyes follows Morris fairly closely. Cadena moves closer to a kind of chant-singing version of the song, with some of the melodic content getting lost. Indeed, Cadena's scream singing wore out his voice, and he was forced to leave the band in the summer of '81. At this point, Henry Rollins, a singer in the Washington, D.C. hardcore punk scene, joined the band as their lead vocalist. He remains the singer most readily identified with Black Flag. He too recorded "Depression," and his version is the most familiar, having been released on the debut full-length album Damaged. Compare Rollins' version to Morris's to hear the contrasting approaches. Rollins almost completely abandons any sense of melody. His is clearly chanting, and sometimes drops the pretense toward pitch altogether. Aside from the vocal performance, the chord progression is worth examining in its own right. After the feedback introduction, the verse begins with a recognizable riff centered on A. The chords are all power chords. There are no thirds, only roots and fifths, but one seems to get a clear sense of the system at work here in this riff, A minor or A aeolian. That is, the progression really only has the 1, the flat 3, and the 4 in A minor. Notice the first part of the riff treats the 4 as a kind of neighbor to the flat 3. And it sets the progression to an interesting bit of syncopation. In many of the recordings, it seems to be grouped as I transcribed it here. That is, 4 groups of 16th notes, or rather a group of 4 16th notes, followed by 3, 3, 2, 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see this numbering above the music. The latter half of the verse moves to 4 as a goal. Notice that this reinforces the general preference in hardcore music and a lot of other popular music as well for 4 in place of 5. When you listen to the Keith Morris version, which is certainly the most melodic, you'll see that he's mostly dealing with chord tones, often just the root. So the first note that he hits is that high A that goes with the main A. And each time we come up from the flat 3 to the 4, he's singing along with it. So you have that right here, all by myself, following up. And then he sings E above the next chord. I ain't got, down to the D. No one else, C back to D. The situation, so the G and the E is bleeding me, so back to the C and the D, and then there is no relief for a person like me, so the whole thing is right here, all by myself, I ain't got no one else. The situation is bleeding me, there is no relief for a person like me. So this very repetitive melody, but still a melody, which contrasts sharply with what Rollins does. The chorus is very simple, just G, A, C, D. With that syncopation again. So just flat 7, 1, 3, flat 3 to 4. So again, something that ends in 4, so an emphasis on 4. The interlude presents a new chord progression. The A down to the F or the flat 6 to the flat 7, the G, and we might expect that then to come back to the A. That would be a very typical progression known as the Aeolian cadence, the flat 6, flat 7, 1. Instead, he makes it into a 2-bar sequence that does go back to the A, but first we have the A, then the flat 6, and we get this move from the G to the B flat. So this is the first time we've had a B flat here. And what that winds up doing is presenting a flat 2. So now we have the question about the system of this song. Is it A Aeolian, A minor, or is it A Phrygian with that flat 2? And notice what happens is the flat 7, of course, acts as a dominant in a lot of rock and certainly in hardcore. And here that flat 2 is also acting as a dominant. So we have two dominant functions that then return us to that A. So we have, and again, and it adds to some of the tension inherent in a song that's ostensibly about depression and yet constantly sounds like it's more about aggression and an aggressive refusal to be depressed or to allow depression in one's life.